Hey, so this is just going to be a quick video on grading for the free response questions so you kind of know where the numbers are coming from. Quick little side note, this is really based on how previous year's free response were graded. I do not know how the grading procedure or process might change for this year's exams because they are so different from what we're used to. So I did want to put that out there, but this should give you at least somewhat of an idea on how things will be graded or how your free response questions will be graded. So I'm going to switch to screen share so I can show you one question. We're going to look at a specific question from the classwork for this week. It's number 2, which was about the environmental science teacher asking kids if they recycle. So this is the question number 2. So I'm going to scroll down. This is from AP Classroom. So I'm going to scroll down. They first give us the answer, which I kind of went over in the classwork video, but I wanted to show you the scoring. So basically on a free response question, they split up the question into 3 or sometimes 4 parts. Sometimes it's based on like how many parts are in the question. This one had an A, B, C, so they just split it into 3 parts for A, B, and C. They sometimes might split it into 4 parts. So maybe A, B has 2 parts, C has 1 part, etc. So it just depends on the question, how they do it, but they usually will split it up somehow into 3 or 4 parts. So even if a question only has 1 part, they will still split up into 3 or 4 parts of things that they're looking for. So in this question, they split up parts A, B, and C are scored as essentially correct, partially correct, or incorrect. So each part, each section will be given an E for essentially correct, a P for partially correct, or an I for incorrect. And that collection of E's, P's, and I's on that particular question will work together to give you a score of from 0 to 4, which we'll get to. So on part A, it says it's scored essentially correct if it has the following 5 components. It uses a standard error formula, P1 minus P over N, shows evidence that they used 0.7 as P hat, shows evidence that 0.116 was correctly used as margin of error, and then shows evidence that Z star was 1.96 was used, and then the 5th thing is includes a single positive whole number answer. So those are the 5 components. If you had all 5 of those in some way or fashion, you would get an E for that part. Partially correct, you would get a P if you only had 3 or 4 of those components. So if you missed 1 or 2 of those things, then you would still get partial correct. And then incorrect if you didn't have at least 3 of those things. If you had less than 3, then you would get incorrect. You wouldn't get any credit for that part. The second part, and it kind of goes into detail in here about what might count for evidence of some of those. Part B, it says essentially correct if the response satisfies the following 3 components. It explains why the responses might differ from the truth. So they're not anonymous, they were asked face-to-face, authority figure. Second one explains how the survey responses might differ from the truth. So students might say yes when they don't actually recycle because they don't want to make the teacher feel bad, etc. And then the third thing was describe the effect of the bias on the point estimate. So basically saying that the proportion is too high, or there's a higher number of yeses than there should be, etc. And doesn't contradict the bias that you described up here. So if you had all 3 of those things, you would get an E. Partial correct would if you only got 2 of those 3 things, and incorrect if you got less than 2. So if you only had 1 or none of those 3 components. And then for part C, it says essentially correct if response gives an answer of 150, so 50% of the 300, and gives an answer of 0.58 as their final answer. So if you talked about 150 in part C, part I, and then gives 0.58 or equivalent in C, part 2. And partial correct if you gave an answer of 150, but accidentally gave 0.42, which is the proportion of no's, does not give an answer of 150, but gives an answer of 0.5, etc. So it kind of goes through what would count as partial, and then incorrect if you don't meet either of those criteria. So then at the end, it kind of gives you what your score comes from. So if you had all 3 essentially correct, you would get 4 points for that question. If you had 2 parts essentially correct and 1 part incorrect, partial, so if you had 2 E's and a P, you would get a 3. Getting a 2 would be 2 essential and 1 incorrect, 2 partial, or 3 partial. etc. So this kind of gives you the options of what you could get a 2 for, and then 1 if you only had 1 essential or 2 parts partial or whatever. So if you had nothing, none of those options, you would get potentially 0. So it kind of goes through, like I said, the big picture is that you would get, for each section in a question, you get an E, a P, or an I, and those E's, P's, and I's combine together to give you some amount of points from 0 to 4 for each question. So that's just a quick little explanation of where the points come from. Sorry if that got a little confusing in the middle. I wanted to specifically look at this one question to give you an example, but that's essentially how free response questions are graded. So even though I don't know exactly how they will grade or change their grading for this test, it should be something similar to that. They divide the question into parts, they look for specific things within each part, and then they give you a score from 0 to 4 based on whether you got E's, P's, and I's throughout the question on the different parts. So I'm going to just tack on a couple things here. 2 things just I want you to know about all of this. Firstly is just know that AP graders want to give you the points. They are going to look for every opportunity that you included the components and the details that they're looking for. So they will look all over, they will find it in there, but to make it easier on them, label your work, be detailed, etc. But they, I promise, are working in your favor. They want you to have the points as much as possible. Second thing is that error carries forward on AP exams. So what that means is that if you make a mistake in part A and you get the wrong answer, and then you use that number in part B to answer another question, you'll lose the points on part A. You'll get an incorrect or maybe a partial on part A, depending on what you did. But then on part B, they're going to kind of start fresh, and they're saying, using that number they got from part A, did they do it correctly otherwise? And then you can still get full points. You can still get the E or essential on part B and then part C, etc. So the error does carry forward, which means they're not going to continually count off for the same mistake on multiple parts. So again, the point of all of this, they're giving you everything they can to make sure that you're getting the highest score possible, to make it easier on your graders and label things, because then you have a better chance of doing well. So that's your little grading video.